We're going to be reading pages 21 to 31 in Patient Zero. The streets are empty. By mid-July, there were 1,000 people dying in London each week. By September, it was up to 1,000 a day. A Londoner named Samuel Pepys wrote in his diary, "But now, how few people I see, and those walking like people that have taken leave of the world." Samuel was a successful businessman, but unlike most wealthy people, he didn't leave London during the plague. Instead, he stayed and recorded his impressions in his diary, which was published almost 2 centuries later. It was one of the most revealing records of what life was like for people in London during that terrible year. In the fall, with plague raging across the city, Samuel wrote, "Lord, how empty the streets are, and melancholy. So many poor, sick people in the streets, full of sores, and so many sad stories overheard as I walk. Everybody talking of this dead, and that man sick, and so many in this place, and so many in that. And they tell me that in Westminster there is never a physician, and but one apothecary left, all being dead, but that there are great hopes of a great decrease this week. God send it." Sure enough, as fall turned to winter and the weather became colder, the plague deaths began to subside. At the end of the year, as people had began cautiously returning to the city, John Grant published an analysis of the epidemic called London's Dreadful Visitation, or a collection of all the bills of mortalities for this present year. It estimated that 68,000 people out of a population of 450,000 had died of plague in a single year. The disease had wiped out 15% of London's population. New knowledge, but no cure. By looking carefully at statistics, John Grant helped people realize that epidemics could be predicted. High numbers of unusual deaths might point to the start of an outbreak of a disease. People no longer had to look to the stars for signs of a coming epidemic. They just had to pay attention to what was happening around them. It was the beginning of a more scientific approach to disease control and prevention. Still, much about plague remained a puzzle in 1665. How did the disease start? How did it spread? Did you catch it from breathing infected air? From contact with a victim? Could you get it from something you ate or drank? There were no answers to these questions, which made preventing and treating plague a risky guessing game. Turn to page 24, or 25 actually. To avoid catching plague, some doctors held gold coins in their mouths while they treated patients, believing that the precious metal protected them. Others recommended burning herbs and spices mixed with vinegar or tar to clean the air. So many people believed that smoking tobacco would prevent plague that schoolboys were punished if they forgot to smoke each morning before their prayers. Some people wore amulets filled with toad poison to ward off the disease. And con artists sold worthless powders and mixtures, passing them off as exotic wonder drugs: powdered unicorn horn, phoenix eggs, and the kidney stones of camels. There was no way to cure the plague, and doctors could do little to treat it. Bleeding had been recommended as a cure for fevers since ancient Greek and Roman times. Although people often died from loss of blood, doctors continued to bleed their patients. Sweating was another common treatment. It was based on the idea that because plague caused fevers, it should be treated with heat. Doctors piled on blankets and stoked up the fire near the victim's bed, hoping that their patient could sweat out the plague poison. If neither bleeding nor sweating worked, there was opium to dull your pain, if you could afford it. When that failed, there was only prayer left. According to John Graunt's statistics, there were only 9,967 births in London that year, compared to 97,306 burials. Some wondered if the city's population would ever recover. John pointed out that London was an incredibly dangerous place to live at all times. Every year, there were far more deaths in the city than there were births. And yet, the population continued to grow because people from surrounding countryside were constantly coming to London looking for work and a better life. John predicted that within a few, turn the page, years, London's population would rebound, thanks to newcomers from the country. Again, he was right. Slowly, life began to return to normal in the city as people forgot the year of terror and death. Return to page 24. Unequal treatment. In 1665, only the wealthy and middle class could afford doctors. The thousands of poor people who suffered from plague during the London epidemic mostly relied on low-cost home remedies. A booklet from the Royal College of Physicians called Certain Necessary Directions for the Prevention and Cure of the Plague recommended this surefire method for treating painful swollen lymph glands or buboes. Pull off the feathers from the tails of living cocks, hens, pigeons, or chickens, and, holding their bills, hold them hard to the botch or swelling, and so keep them at that part until they, the birds, die. And by this means, draw out the poison. No chicken sandy? There were alternatives. Take a great onion, hollow it, put it in a fig, cut small, put into a wet paper, and roast it in embers. Apply it hot unto the tumor. One popular remedy was called Venice treacle. A treacle is a thick syrup. To make it, you needed nearly 60 ingredients, from cinnamon, pepper, and cloves to exotic items like viper flesh, opium, beaver glands, and Dead Sea salts. Vipers all sold out. London treacle was a simpler option, a mixture of cumin seeds, bayberries, snake root, cloves, and honey. Turn to page 26. Finding answers in Hong Kong. More than 200 years after the epidemic in London, scientists finally identified the source of plague. In 1894, an epidemic of bubonic plague in Hong Kong killed 80,000 people. The governor, Sir William Robinson, called for scientists to come to Hong Kong to search for solutions and save the city. A famous Japanese scientist called Shibasaburo Kitasato answered his plea. Shibasaburo's arrival was celebrated in the papers, and he was given his own laboratory and a staff of assistants. Nobody paid much attention to the other foreign researcher who answered the call for help. Alexander Yersin was a young Swiss bacteriologist, a specialist studying disease-carrying microbes and how to cure or treat the illness they caused, who had been practicing medicine in the French colony of Indochina, now the countries of Vietnam and Cambodia. As an unknown scientist, Alexander didn't get the same warm welcome as the famous Shibasaburo. The Hong Kong officials didn't even offer him a laboratory. He had to pay for his own lab, built a lowly straw hut not far from the much grander building occupied by Shibasaburo. The two scientists were soon racing to be the first doctor to discover the source of plague. The competition was so fierce that Shibasaburo tried to prevent Alexander from getting access to the bodies of plague victims. Alexander had to bribe the soldiers guarding the plague wards of the hospital to bring him the blood and tissue samples he needed. That June, each man announced that he had successfully isolated the bacteria that causes plague. Turn to page 28. At first, Shibasaburo was credited with the discovery, but then the scientific community decided that Alexander had been first, and the bacteria was named Yersinia pestis in his honor. A few years later, French researcher Paul Louis Simond discovered that fleas called Xenosylla chiopis transferred the infection from rat to rat. When a rat died, its fleas sometimes jumped to a nearby human. Their bites passed the disease to humans. It took nearly 40 years for Simmons' research to be accepted by the scientific and medical communities, but the mystery of plague was finally solved. Turn back to page 27, the cotton connection. London's Great Plague may have started when infected rats and their fleas hitched a ride to the city on bales of cotton imported from Holland. Just the year before, more than 50,000 people had died in a plague epidemic in Amsterdam, Holland. And there was a busy trade in cotton between the two cities. The first deaths in the London epidemic happened in a neighborhood called St. Giles in the Fields, where many dock workers lived. These workers could have been bitten by plague infected fleas while unloading bales of cotton from the boat and bringing it into the city for sale. Ironically, John Grant may have been selling cloth made from that cotton in his shop, while spending his evenings tracking the spread of the epidemic it had caused through his city. Trade, travel, and disease have a long history of connection. From the trade caravans that brought plague rats to Europe from Central Asia to the slave ships that carried mosquito breeding yellow fever to the United States, to today's international flights that can carry virus infected humans anywhere they want to go. Whenever humans have found a way to make travel easier and faster, they've also made the spread of disease easier and faster. Turn to page 28. The future of plague. Today, plague can be successfully treated with antibiotics if a patient gets medical attention in time. But the disease is still a feared killer. In 1993, South and Central India were rattled by several earthquakes that damaged a number of cities, including Bangalore, Bombay, Hyderabad, and Madras, as well as many smaller villages and towns. In the earthquake's aftermath, huge shanty towns and slums sprung up to house people who had been left homeless by the disaster. The shanty towns also sheltered large numbers of rats. In September of 1994, plague broke out in one of the largest slums in the city of Surat. 55 people died, an insignificant number compared to the terrible death tolls of the medieval plague epidemics, but enough to make headlines around the world. Commercial air traffic to and from India stopped. The stock market in India crashed. Trade halted, and the media went crazy, speculating about the possibility that plague could spread to other countries, triggering a massive pandemic. Luckily, it didn't happen. Turn to page 31. Although plague is considered a disease of the past, it is alive and well and living in rodents around the world. Plague is endemic in parts of Africa, including the island of Madagascar, where the disease infects a few hundred people each year. In 2017, Madagascar had an outbreak of plague that was traced back to a man who had developed symptoms while traveling across the island in a shared public taxi. 31 people who came into contact with him came down with the plague, and 4 people died. The World Health Organization considers plague a re-emerging disease, a possible threat that requires constant monitoring. Addicted to statistics. In 2020, the world tracked the emergence of new cases of COVID-19 day by day, and even hour by hour, in the news and on social media. In 1665, people watched the numbers published in the bills of mortality just as eagerly. At least 5,000 copies of the bills were printed every week, and people snatched up the latest issue to find out which neighborhoods had new cases and whether the epidemic was showing signs of slowing down. The bills of mortality, to all our griefs, is increased by 399 this week, and the increase is general through the whole city and suburbs, which makes us all sad, wrote Londoner Samuel Pepys on November 9th, 1665. Anyone following the toll of COVID deaths COVID-19 deaths in the news and on social media would understand just how Pepys must have felt. Turn back to page 29. A perfect pair, cities and disease. As soon as humans started living in permanent settlements, we opened the door to disease-causing microbes. Disease spreads easily in crowded conditions and densely packed cities with poor sanitation. And densely packed cities with poor sanitations are the perfect breeding ground for epidemics. Until the 20th century, so many city dwellers died each year from infectious diseases that without a steady stream of new arrivals from the countryside, most cities would have soon become ghost towns. Plague was one of the most feared diseases because its deadly epidemics seemed to come out of nowhere. And in fact, the agent responsible for transmitting plague to humans is almost invisible. The culprit is the rat flea. Attracted by humans' garbage, rats had moved into the settlements, bringing along their annoying roommates, Yersinia pestis, the bacteria that causes plague, in their guts and bloodstreams, and the fleas in their fur. Once a flea bites a rat infected with Yersinia, it carries the bacteria along to the next rat, or person, it dines on. In the crowded, unsanitary cities, fleas jumped easily from rat to human. For many unlucky people, those flea bites weren't only itchy, they were deadly. As trade routes were established between cities, rats carrying plague went along for the ride. They spread across Asia and Europe, touching off the bubonic plague pandemic of the 1300s and the epidemics of plague that followed, including the Great Plague of London. Turn the page. 3 plagues, 1 cause. There are 3 types of plague: bubonic, pneumonic, and septicemic. All 3 forms of plague are caused by the same bacteria, Yersinia pestis. Bubonic plague is the most famous and the most feared, but is actually the least deadly of the 3. In bubonic plague, the bacteria attack the lymphatic system, causing lymph nodes in the patient's neck, underarms, or groin to develop painful swellings, traditionally called buboes, as well as reddish or purple markings on the skin. In 17th century England, those marks were known as plague tokens. Before the buboes or plague tokens appeared, the patient suffers fevers, headaches, chills, vomiting, and extreme exhaustion. More than half of all bubonic plague sufferers died within 2 weeks of the appearance of buboes. Pneumonic plague is even more deadly. It attacks the lungs and it spreads through the air when victims cough and sneeze. Nearly everyone infected with pneumonic plague will die within 2 to 4 days. It starts with fever and a headache, but soon the victim begins coughing up blood and their lungs fill with fluid until they can no longer breathe. In septicemic plague, the rarest form of the disease, the bacteria infect the patient's bloodstream. Death can happen so quickly that sometimes no symptoms appear. When there are symptoms, they include fever and weakness, followed by bleeding from the mouth and nose and internal bleeding. Without treatment, victims of septicemic plague will die in less than a day. Today, antibiotics can successfully treat about 85% of cases of plague if the drugs are started during the first 24 hours after infection. And that is the end of chapter 1 of Patient